for myself, it's sort of rather extraordinary to find myself here in Watkins bookshop in 2017 with my books in the window, because I used to come here many years ago when it was a tiny little shop, just quarter of this size, and delve into whatever spiritual book I could find. I'd sort of wait and see which one would kind of leap out of the shelf at me, because I was just seeking. And it was the most wonderful treasure trove of goodies in here. So I'm really quite amazed to find myself now with books here, and I never ever thought that would happen. So tonight I'm going to tell you the stories of two extraordinary and very powerful revolutionary women. Freda Bedi, who was born Freda Houston, and Tenzin Palmo, who was born Diane Perry. And they have had the most extraordinary, inspirational lives and have affected people all over the world. And they were both extraordinarily brave. Now, they were revolutionary in different ways. Freda Bedi was an outward-going revolutionary. Anyway, I'll tell you a bit more about her later. And Tenzin Palmo was very much an inner revolutionary type of woman. However, in spite of their very different lifestyles, very different, they both were motivated by the same thing, which was a kind of deep-seated and heartfelt, intuitive yearning to find spiritual truth and then to live it. And they both lived it wholeheartedly and without compromise. And they were both motivated by innate compassion. So they weren't just seeking knowledge for knowledge's sake. They were both completely informed by the desire to help and serve humanity in whichever way they could. They had a lot in common. They were both English. They were both friends. They met each other when Freda was in her 50s and Tenzin Palmo was in her early 20s. And they were, as I said, they were both very radical. I never met Freda, unfortunately, but everybody used to talk about her a lot. I missed her by just a few short months, really. But Tenzin Palmo I did meet, and she remains, thankfully, a very good friend. And she's not, put off by what I wrote about her, which is very nice. So they both became Buddhist nuns. They are both trailblazers, and they both have inspired people everywhere, lay and religious alike. And they have influenced, and this is not an exaggeration, they have influenced many people. And they have been an inspiration particularly for women, and particularly for nuns, Buddhist nuns. And I'll go into that later. They both sort of crashed through the spiritual glass ceiling, which exists in Buddhism like it has done in many of the traditional religions. So I'll start with Freda Bedi. Yes, I was going to call this book Mummy. I wanted to call this book Mummila. And then the subtitle was going to be The Revolutionary Life of Freda Bedi. But the publishers didn't like that. So it all got changed. Well, actually, since they were American, I was rather anxious in case they were going to change it to Mommy, which would have been horrible. But Freda basically was mother, and she saw herself as that, to everybody. She couldn't help herself. She wanted to care, she was hands-on, and she was very much that kind of gathering people up and helping them, which I'll explain a bit more later. And she had a completely big life. It was quite a difficult book to write because she had so many roles. She did so many things. She was an Oxford graduate. She was a scholar. She was a professor. She was a teacher. She was a writer. She was a very advanced social worker. And she was a wife and mother of 4 children. And then she became, in middle age, a Buddhist nun. So it was quite hard to kind of get all these threads together into one continuous thread. But however, the relevant bit, the juicy bit of Freda's story at the moment is that, well, first of all, she was born in Derby, above a watchmaker's shop, from quite humble background. And then she won 3 scholarships to Oxford. She was very bright. And so this kind of completely changed her life. She met Barbara Castles at Oxford. For those non-English people here, Barbara Castles was an amazingly feisty left-winger who became, I think it was the first Secretary of State in the Labour government. And she became very close friends with Freda and kind of brought her out. And then she also met her husband, her future husband, who was called Bedi, BPL Bedi, and he was a Sikh. And she married him amidst much scandal. And he was committed to liberating India from British imperialism. So anyway, 70 years ago, Freda had just emerged from jail, where she was imprisoned for sedition, being a follower of Gandhi. And she got hard labour. She had the distinction of being the first British woman to be imprisoned for rousing the Indian people against colonial imperialistic rule. She was given hard labour. And she was also, after that, she was involved in partition, helping all the refugees in, mopping up the bloodbath, which happened. Her heart just had to go out to everybody. It was like, that's why she joined Gandhi, because she couldn't stand the inequality of the poor and the deprived and the social inequality. She couldn't stand it, so she had to do something about it. And then during partition, she also ran covert messages disguised in a burqa to their great friend, Sheikh Abdullah, who was called the Lion of Kashmir. He wanted to stay with India. It's all very political. It's in the book. I won't go into it now. But basically, she was on his side. He'd been banished from Kashmir. So she was taking messages from him to his people in Kashmir disguised as a burqa, in a burqa. She was constantly being harassed by the secret police, and she was unbelievably brave, the same way as she was brave to go to jail for what she believed in. Gandhi handpicked her as one of his satyagrahis. Anyway, I don't want to get too political about that. So as you can see, she was a big woman who had a big life, and she kind of was the first in so many things. She was the first woman to marry a coloured man in Oxford. The scandal went all the way to Parliament. She was the first white woman to be imprisoned for Gandhi. She was the first to go into the Tibetan refugee camps when the Dalai Lama fled into India in exile, with the Tibetans following him. They were in the most terrible, terrible state. And because Freda by this time was a national heroine, she knew Nehru, she knew Indira Gandhi, she was very, very connected. And Nehru sent her to look after the Tibetans and all the refugees because he knew of the partition, with the refugees in partition. So she became a Tibetan nun, having met the Tibetans and the Dalai Lama. And she became the first fully ordained Tibetan nun, which was an amazing thing, because Tibetan nuns had been kept at the level of novices. They weren't given the higher ordination. The higher ordination would have allowed them to have all the teachings which were afforded to the monks. So they were kept at a very lowly status. But Freda Bedi got the first full ordination. And that set off a revolution, a different revolution of a different kind, which is still ongoing today. She started the first nunnery, and she also had the insight, nobody else had it, that the people who were going to bring Tibetan Buddhism to the West would be the reincarnated lamas, which is a Tibetan speciality. And so she started up a school for these Tibetan reincarnated lamas to teach them English and basically the ways of the world, because Tibet had been so closed off and tight and hidden. And she felt that they had to have some education. And those people who she taught then did. She was right. They came out to the West and they became the first Tibetan teachers in the West, starting up a whole new, opening up so many avenues. Now Tibetan Buddhism, as you know, and the Dalai Lama are known all over the world. When I used to come to Watkins, I don't think there were any books on Tibetan Buddhism at all. Nobody really knew anything about the Dalai Lama. I was the first journalist to interview the Dalai Lama. I was a journalist before I became an author. And I got an exclusive interview when he first came to London in the 80s. And I got the interview for the Sunday Times. And the features editor came to me and said, "Excuse me, but who exactly is the Dalai Lama?" That's of the Sunday Times. The editor knew, of course. And the Dalai Lama then only half-filled Caxton Hall. So that is how amazingly big Tibetan Buddhism has come in just such a few years. Anyway, Freda Bedi was also a wife, and she was also a mother. One of her children died in infancy because she was out campaigning for Gandhi. Her second son is a Bollywood legend and was a James Bond villain in Octopussy. So she had this incredibly broad, wide life. So she was a mother in many respects. In fact, all the Tibetans started calling her mummy because she looked after them. She looked after them all. She had them in her home. She would do anything for them. She got them all the papers they wanted. She got them jobs. She got them all sponsors. She got medicines for them. So they all began to call her mummy. And then everybody else began to call her mummy as well. And then the Tibetans put on the suffix mummy la. Mummy la. La is a honorific. So what actually triggered all this? Well, the death of her father was the first trigger when she was 6 or 7 years old. She was a sensitive child. And this death of her father, as she said, opened up her heart to all the sorrows of the world. It's fostered in her compassion for everybody because she understood sorrow and she understood suffering. And she said that when she was at school and they used to have the Remembrance Day services every year in November, she fainted. That's how sensitive she was to the death of her father. Okay, so She was a spiritual seeker since childhood. Then she had an enlightenment experience in Burma because Nehru sent her to Burma on a UNESCO mission because she was a big social worker. And so when she died, her legacy was enormous. You know, she really got so many things happening. Anyway, I've got to stop there. I've been given my time signal because I have to tell you about the next person. You can ask questions. You can ask questions if you like. So Freda was definitely a doer. Freda was a hands-on. In biblical terms, she was Martha. And the next person who I'm going to tell you about was Tenzin Palmo, was much more a Mary. So she had courage of a different sort. She was also she was a Londoner. She was born in Bethnal Green, which is a real Cockney. Her mum and dad were both pearly kings and queens. You can't get more London than that. And her father was a fishmonger. Interestingly enough, her father also died, but when she was 2. But it didn't bother her like it did Freda. So she was called Diane Perry, and she was very frail and very ill all her life. She almost didn't survive birth, and she was advised to become a librarian because it was like the most. She was very bookish, and she, like Freda was also terribly bookish, and they thought that a librarian would be the most sort of gentle, non-taxing work for her. So she found her path very early, unlike Freda. She knew from a very early age that she wanted to be a nun, but she couldn't find out where or what sort. And then, again, like me, one day in her library, a book leapt out at her, and it was called The Path Unshaken, and she read it, and she said, "That's it, I'm a Buddhist." There was no Buddhism in London at all at that point, except the Buddhist Society. So she went along there, started by Christmas Humphreys, the judge in Eccleston Square. And so she went to that, and then she said, "I've got to get on with it." She was only 20. So she wrote to Freda Bedi, who was the only person operating anything in India at that time. And Freda Bedi had started her school and said, "Come, come, come, I'll help you. So Tenzin Palmo set off by herself, aged 20, on a boat, banana boat, and then made her way up to Dalhousie, where the school was, and there was Freda. So there was 30 years difference between them. But Freda was a mentor to her, as she was to many. And she said, oh, Freda told her about this Tibetan, and the moment she heard his name, Tenzin Palmo said, "That's my teacher. That's the one I know is for me." She hadn't seen him, met him, she just knew by the name. So that was her. She was off. She was on her 21st birthday, she met her teacher, and then she started. For Tenzin Palmo, it was the inner path. She was following a path of meditation. She wanted to help people. Definitely. But for Tenzin Palmo, it was the way of actually clearing herself and advancing herself first before she felt she was capable of helping others. It was the path of self-development. So, and she, like Freda, she was completely determined and completely single-minded. She put up with so much hardship. She never had any money. Anyway, she spent 6 years with her teacher in Himachal Pradesh, which is in North India. Then she wanted to be more devoted, more committed to her meditation. She spent 6 years then in a very remote monastery, halfway up a mountain in Ladakh, on the way in Lahore, which is on the way to Ladakh. And then even that was too busy for her. So then she went to a cave, which was way, 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 way up. Way up. She spent 12 years in that cave. And it was the most heroic. I mean, I can't imagine it. I climbed to the cave to get the material for the book. It was unbelievably high. It's over 13,000 feet. I don't know, I'm not very good at meters. 13,000, I mean, that's about as high as Mont Blanc. So you can imagine living on the top of Mont Blanc, you know, for 12 years. She did come down at the first, every now and again. Now imagine this. It was tiny, this cave. It wasn't even a cave, it was more like an overhang. And they built up the wall in front of the overhang. And it had a little door and a little window. She had no bed. She never slept. She never lay down. She slept, had a meditation box, sat upright. She had no running water. She had to go to a spring to get water. She was snowed in for half the year. No electricity. She had no telephone. There was no Wi-Fi. There was nothing. There was nothing. It was extremely beautiful. She had around her were all these snow peaks of the Himalayas. The energy was fabulous because all the meditators had been meditating up there for centuries. Centuries, so the whole place kind of buzzed with a spiritual power. I mean, and so this is what she did. And I mean, there's lots of details like how did she live and blah, blah, blah. It's all in the book, and I haven't got time to tell you now. But there was danger. And so I think what I'm going to do is read you a little bit. Well, first of all, when I first met her, she'd just come out of the cave. And I was just astonished because you'd think she'd be a bit psychotic or a bit kind of mad, you know, having spent all that time in isolation. She was completely sane. She was completely chatty. She was completely sociable. She was completely sane, and her eyes were bright, bright, bright. So I said to her, you know, the question everybody wants to ask was, how does it help anybody, you disappearing up to a cave for all that time? How does it help? So she said, it's like if you want to be a surgeon. If you want to help people and you want to be a surgeon, you don't just go out in the street and start cutting people up. You have to do a lot of training if you really want to be a good surgeon. If you want to be the best, if you want to know how to help each person perfectly according to their predispositions. She says that's what you do. So within Buddhism has so many methods. It's a methodology. You're not up in your cave just blissing out, you know, becoming a kind of cosmic blob. You know, you're actually doing incredible work. It's like your mind. You're working with your mind. Your mind is not the same as the brain. It's your consciousness, and it's like a computer. Not that I understand computers, as anybody who knows me will tell you, but you're going down and down and down and down and down into the chips, and then into the lower chips, and then into the workings of the chips, so that you understand your own inner reality, so that you face your own problems. Because up there's no one to help you. You can't pick up the phone, you can't pick up a glass of wine, you can't watch a movie, which is what we all do, you know, when we're in trouble or when we're bored. We have all these distractions. Up there, you have nothing. You just have to work with yourself. And so you realize who you really are in your fundamental nature. And according to Buddhism, we have all got the potential of Buddha, the enlightened, awakened mind within us. It's just a matter of shedding stuff. It's not a matter of gaining more stuff. It's a matter of getting rid of stuff. Getting rid of all our confused thoughts, our mad thoughts, our obsessive thoughts. You know, our anger, our lust, our greed, our dissatisfaction, our mad monkey mind. And you can only do that, really, if you want to be effective, by being alone. You know, by actually putting in the work. She put in the work. And she emerged as one of the best and most popular global teachers that we have today. And she's completely sane. She reads all the newspapers, she reads all the books, she knows exactly, and people come to her all the time, non-stop with problems. Non-stop. She just serves. So there are two ways of serving. And I think both these women have been unbelievably courageous. I mean, what they've put up with in order to fulfill their missions of helping people, I think has just been absolutely awe-inspiring. And I think particularly for Freda Bedi, who had such a big historical role to play, nobody had heard of her at all. And yet what she achieved within, the footprint of modern India, for the women of India, because she really, really taught the women. She was really interested in having equality all the time, and equality in religion, equality all the time. What she did, and helping to bring Buddhism to the West, it was her who told the Karmapa, who was teaching at this very bookshop just a couple of weeks ago, very, very big Lama. It was her who persuaded the predecessor, reincarnation, to go to the West and teach, because she was his heart disciple. So she did the most amazing service. She died when she was 66. So what she crammed into her life, I just can't believe it. She had an organization which went all over the world, which still exists, to find sponsors and money for all the Tibetans. Tenzin Palmo is working non-stop. So they are truly inspiring, wonderful women. And I felt their stories should be told. So if you like, shall I read you a little bit, or would you like to hear? Okay. So I'll read you a bit. Freda was absolutely fearless. So this is when she was arrested, first of all, when she was taken to jail. And she'd chosen to go to jail. I mean, that was part of the deal which you did when you signed up for being one of Gandhi's people. She would have given her life, actually. That's what she signed up for as well. So this is it. She was scared. Suddenly I felt alone, agonizingly alone. I could have wept for my sheer aloneness. I wanted to talk to BPL, that's her husband, to have his cheery voice near me, but he was in jail too for the same thing. I suppose in all crises of our life, we get that feeling of isolation, as though we are treading a path into the future all alone. For all the love that surrounds us. When we first leave home, when we marry, when we have a choice to make at some crossroads of our life, perhaps we feel like that when we are on the brink of death. And on the borders of that aloneness, there comes another feeling of being given the strength to carry on, of not being alone anymore. Anyway, she went to trial, and she was sentenced. And she was given, after fumbling in his defense of India rules book, the judge handed her the sentence: 6 months rigorous imprisonment in Lahore female jail. Surely you mean Lahore women's jail, replied Freda archly, offended by his grammar. So you got a sense of how feisty she was. Convict number 3613 started her prison sentence on a suitably rebellious note by refusing to hand over her wedding ring, which was classified as jewellery. It had not left her finger since the day she married BPL, and she was not prepared to part with it now. Drawing herself up to her full height and putting on her most English accent, she quoted her rights as a Class A political prisoner, which did not state that jewellery had to be relinquished. She won. Anyway, then she was marched off to her quarters, her cell. Yes. And then she wrote in her diary, "My cellmates are quiet, determined souls, not noisy rebels, the stuff of which Gandhi's little army is made. They are not professional politicians, but widows and married women who have left behind their children, husbands and households to offer themselves up for a rest in the service of their country. So then she became a nun. I write about that, the kind of conflict that women have between being a mother, physical mother, and then wanting to be a mother to a bigger cause and what that causes. And then she said, throughout her life, her spiritual calling was never far below the surface. It had informed both her political and her social work. Quoting, "Although I was engaged in political activity, I was never interested in politics. I'm interested in freedom, freedom of the mind. And when I took up social work, as well as writing and teaching, the deep feeling was for freedom, integrity and human dignity, which was accomplished by Mahatma Gandhi, who taught us the way of love. This is the Christian way too. When somebody wants to knock your head with a stick in a demonstration, you offer your head to be hit. You sit down, you don't run away, and you don't feel a minute's resentment against your adversary. Many of the Indian police were decent people who just wanted to make a living to care for their wives and children. Of course, I was a political and social activist, but inwardly there was always meditation. I don't think I could have borne those years with all the difficulties, all the strain, if I had not done so. I think meditation should be integrated with home life from an early age. The earlier the better. I don't think the strains of the modern world can be borne unless you have an inner meditative life. It leads to saner people who don't crack up or have to go to mental hospitals or take sleeping tablets. These are all due to excessive strain. The basis of a spiritual life, whether you are ordained or lay, is non-violence, not to harm others, otherwise you yourself will be harmed. The law of karma comes in. It's like throwing a pebble in a pool. The ripples of harming go far. So shall I read you a little bit from the other books? I think I'm up to time. Sorry. I've been told. Did Freda's children have anything to say in their later life about their mother's work? Yes, they said a lot. And that was one of my main questions and one of the things I explore in the book. Yes, they did. Now, adults, they all love their mother and they all spoke highly of her. Must put that on the record. But the youngest daughter, Guliama, who lives in Boston now, she was put in boarding school aged 5 so that her mother could continue with her religious work. And although it was hard for her, and she was the youngest also when her mother became a nun. So it was all a bit of a shock, but it was mainly also a shock because Freda was the main breadwinner. So when she gave up her work to do her spiritual path, the money her job money ran out, and also the flat. So it was a tremendous upheaval. But Freda just, she loved her children and she was always there for them. It was not like a Christian nun where you don't, you're kind of locked up and you don't see them. But she said, I've become a mother to all the world now, the universal mother. So yes, it's a good question and one I explored a lot in the book. 15 or 16 when she became a nun. So she'd waited until that time when she thought that, it wasn't like she was very little. But yes, she went ahead but Freda had always done what she wanted to do because she had this mission. So you have to say, I said to her, can one be Che Guevara, and Mother Teresa at the same time? Can you do it, really? Was her husband supportive of what she was doing? And the answer is yes, completely. He was a character, she was a character, and he was even a bigger character. He was the All India hammer throwing champion, and he was the 16th direct descendant of the founder of the Sikhs, Guru Nanak. So he was like aristocracy within Indian circles. And he believed, I mean, yeah. He was just fun. He was a revolutionary. No, he was totally liberal. And he went on to become a guru in his own right too, in a completely different way. That's also in the book. He was completely, she was more the disciplinarian. He just sort of allowed everybody to do what they wanted, as far as I could tell. You know. Yes, but he was completely. And they remained close all their lives, even though she went off and became a nun and he married somebody else. They always had enormous respect for each other, and they both believed in freedom of choice. They both believed in that. So, yeah.